The night was still in the quiet German town of Ulm, where the Danube River flowed gently under a sky dusted with stars. The year was 1879, and in a modest home nestled among cobblestone streets, a child was born, a child who would one day unravel the secrets of the universe. His name was Albert Einstein. From the very beginning, Albert was different. While other babies babbled and giggled, he observed the world with a quiet intensity, his deep brown eyes taking in every detail, the way candlelight flickered against the walls, the sound of rain tapping against the window, the mysterious movement of shadows as they stretched and shifted with the sun. His parents, Hermann and Pauline Einstein, often wondered about their son's silent curiosity. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his words carried a weight beyond his years. Then came the day that would change everything. On his 5th birthday, Albert's father handed him a small, polished compass. The moment the boy held it in his hands, he was mesmerized. No matter how he turned it, the needle always pointed north, as if guided by an invisible hand. "Papa," he whispered, "why does it do that?" His father explained, magnetism, the Earth's hidden force. And from that moment, Albert was enchanted by the unseen mysteries of the world. School, however, was not kind to a mind like his. The rigid classrooms, the strict teachers demanding memorization, it all felt like a cage. One instructor even told his parents, "Your son will never amount to anything. He's too slow, too lost in his thoughts." But Albert wasn't slow. His mind was a whirlwind of questions, too vast for simple recitations. While other children chanted arithmetic tables, he wondered, what if numbers could describe the stars? What if time wasn't the same for everyone? When his family moved to Italy, Albert finally tasted freedom. Gone were the cold, structured halls of German schools. Instead, he wandered through sunlit Italian streets, napping in meadows with a book over his face, dreaming of light and motion. One afternoon, lying in the grass, he imagined himself riding a beam of sunlight. What would happen if he chased it? Could he catch up? Would time slow down? The thought thrilled him, though he didn't yet know it would one day become the foundation of his greatest discovery. Years passed, and Albert grew into a young man with wild hair and an even wilder imagination. He enrolled at the Swiss Federal Polytechnic in Zurich, where he met Mileva Merrick, a brilliant physicist who shared his passion for the mysteries of the universe. They spent long nights discussing science, philosophy, and the nature of reality, their bond deepening with every conversation. But life was not easy. After graduation, Albert struggled to find work, eventually settling for a job as a patent clerk in Bern. Yet, even as he reviewed inventions by day, his mind never stopped exploring. In 1905, at just 26 years old, he published 4 papers that would change science forever. One explained the photoelectric effect, proving light was made of particles. Another revealed the erratic dance of atoms. But the most revolutionary of all was his theory of relativity, where he declared that time and space were not fixed, they bent and stretched like fabric. And then came the equation that would echo through history, E equals mc, a simple yet profound statement that energy and mass were one and the same. The world didn't understand him at first. Scientists scoffed, and few could grasp the enormity of his ideas. But Albert pressed on, his quiet determination unshaken. By 1915, he unveiled his masterpiece, the general theory of relativity, proving that gravity was not a force, but the bending of space itself. When astronomers confirmed his predictions during a solar eclipse in 1919, Albert Einstein became a global sensation overnight, but fame came with a price. As the world celebrated him, his personal life unraveled. His marriage to Mileva crumbled under the weight of distance and diverging paths. Heartbroken, he eventually found solace in his cousin, Elsa, whose warmth and care brought him comfort in the storm of his growing celebrity. Then came the darkness of the 1930s as the Nazis rose to power. Albert, a Jewish scientist, became a target. Forced to flee Germany, he settled in America, where he continued his work at Princeton University. But the world was changing. When he learned of the atomic bomb's potential, he wrote to President Roosevelt, warning of the danger. Yet, when the bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he was overcome with regret. "If only I had known," he lamented, "I would have become a watchmaker." In his later years, Albert became a gentle sage, his wild hair turned white, his eyes still burning with curiosity. He spent his days searching for a single theory that could explain all the forces of the universe, a dream he never fulfilled. Yet, he never stopped wondering. He played his violin, sailed on quiet lakes, and answered letters from children who asked him about science, life, and the stars. On April 18, 1955, Albert Einstein closed his eyes for the last time, but his mind, his boundless, brilliant mind, left behind a legacy that would endure for centuries. His equations still guide us, his questions still inspire us, and his spirit lingers in every scientist who dares to ask, "What if?" So, tonight, as you drift into sleep, imagine yourself floating among the stars, where time bends, light dances, and somewhere Albert is still riding that beam of sunlight into the unknown. The universe is vast, but here, in this moment, you are safe, you are warm, and the mysteries of the cosmos can wait until tomorrow. The train rattled through the Swiss countryside, its rhythmic clatter blending with the hum of Albert's restless thoughts. At 16, he was running away, not from home, but from a system that had tried to cage his curiosity. The German gymnasium had felt like a prison, with its rigid schedules and teachers who valued obedience over imagination. Now, as the Alps rolled past his window in great waves of green and stone, he breathed deeply for the first time in years. Italy had been a revelation. Without the suffocating structure of formal schooling, Albert's mind had begun to stretch its wings. He spent his days wandering through Milan's sun-dappled piazzas, lingering in bookshops where he discovered the works of Kant and Hume. At night, he would lie on the roof of his parents' house, tracing constellations with his finger while pondering a question that had begun to haunt him. What would happen if he could ride alongside a beam of light? His father worried about this aimless existence. "You must think of your future, Albert," Hermann Einstein would say, his voice heavy with concern. But how could Albert explain that he was thinking of nothing but the future, not his own, but the future of human understanding? The solution came unexpectedly. The Polytechnic school in Zurich didn't care about his poor grades in subjects like French and Greek. Here, they valued mathematical brilliance, and when Albert solved complex problems that stumped older students, the professors took notice. Yet even in this more open environment, he remained an outsider. While his classmates rushed to lectures, Albert would often skip class to play his violin by the lake or lose himself in thought experiments about the nature of space and time. It was during these solitary moments that he began developing ideas that would later shake the foundations of physics. Sitting on a park bench one autumn afternoon, watching leaves spiral to the ground, it occurred to him that gravity might not be a force at all, but something far more profound, a curvature in the fabric of reality itself. The thought sent shivers down his spine, though he couldn't yet put it into precise mathematical terms. His only confidant was Mileva Merrick, a fellow student whose sharp intellect matched his own. They would spend hours in Zurich's cafes, their notebooks filled not with love poems but with equations and sketches of thought experiments. When they talked about physics, Albert's normally quiet voice would grow animated, his hands painting shapes in the air as he described his vision of a universe where time flowed differently for observers in motion. Yet for all his growing insights, the world remained indifferent. After graduation, Albert found himself unemployed, surviving on occasional tutoring jobs, while Mileva struggled through pregnancy. The year 1900 found him answering a newspaper ad for a patent clerk, a humble position that would, unknowingly, set the stage for one of the most remarkable intellectual revolutions in history. As he walked to work each morning through Bern's medieval streets, past clock towers marking time with mechanical precision, Albert's mind worked on problems far beyond the electrical devices he was paid to evaluate. In the quiet of his small apartment, while his infant son, Hans Albert, slept nearby, he filled page after page with calculations that would soon change everything. The world thought him a failure, a dropout, a poor husband, a third-rate clerk. But in the stillness of those Swiss nights, between the cries of his baby and the sighs of his disillusioned wife, Albert Einstein was quietly composing the symphony of ideas that would make 1905 his miracle year. The rain fell softly on Bern that spring morning in 1905, painting the cobblestone streets in shimmering shades of gray. Albert Einstein walked with his usual distracted pace, his mind already racing ahead of his body, leaping from thought to thought as his worn shoes splashed through puddles reflecting the pale dawn light. The patent office where he worked as a third-class technical expert loomed ahead, its stone facade as unremarkable as his official position suggested. Yet within this ordinary setting, something extraordinary was about to occur, a revolution that would begin not in a university laboratory, but in the quiet corners of a young clerk's restless mind. Each morning, after hanging his damp coat, Albert would arrange his desk with mechanical precision, patent applications to the left, his personal notes to the right, a fresh pot of ink positioned just so. His supervisor, the perpetually exasperated hair hauler, often complained about the ink stains on Albert's fingers and cuffs, evidence of nights spent pursuing abstract calculations rather than rest. If you applied yourself to patents as you do to these fantasies, Hauler would grumble, shaking his head at the equations spilling from Albert's notebook onto official documents. But Albert had discovered something remarkable about his mundane job. The mechanical work of evaluating electrical devices left the greater part of his mind free to wander through the cosmos. It was during one such routine evaluation of an electromechanical synchronizer that Albert's pencil suddenly stilled above the patent papers. For weeks, he had been wrestling with a thought experiment that both thrilled and terrified him. What would happen if someone could ride alongside a beam of light? The implications had been tickling at the edges of his consciousness, but now, as the morning light slanted through the office windows, the pieces fell together with startling clarity. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached for his personal notebook, nearly knocking over the inkwell in his haste. If the speed of light was truly constant, as Maxwell's equations suggested, then time itself must bend to accommodate this cosmic speed limit. The very foundations of Newtonian physics, which had stood unshaken for centuries, suddenly appeared to him as a magnificent but incomplete edifice. That evening, as the gas lamps flickered to life across Bern, Albert rushed home. Through the winding medieval streets, his mind afire with revelation. He found Mileva in their small kitchen, stirring a pot of stew, while keeping one eye on their toddling son, Hans Albert. Without preamble, Albert began arranging salt shakers and cutlery on the worn wooden table. "Imagine," he said, his voice tight with excitement, "that this fork is a train moving at nearly the speed of light. ... Mileva sighed but listened patiently, as she had learned to do. Recognizing that particular gleam in his eyes that meant supper would likely grow cold before he remembered to eat. As spring blossomed into summer, the apartment on Kramgas became a crucible of revolutionary ideas. Albert worked late into the humid nights, his shirt sticking to his back as he filled page after page with calculations. Sometimes Mileva would wake to find him asleep at the kitchen table, his head pillowed on an open notebook, ink smudged across his cheek like some strange academic war paint. She would gently remove the pencil from his slack fingers and cover his shoulders with a blanket, her eyes lingering on the equations that were slowly changing their lives in ways neither could yet comprehend. The heat wave that summer broke records across Switzerland. On Sundays, when the patent office was closed, Albert would take his notes to the banks of the Ari River, where he could work in the shade of ancient chestnut trees. It was there, watching dust motes dance in shafts of golden light, that he solved another great puzzle: the erratic movement of pollen grains in water that had baffled scientists for decades. His calculations proved what some still doubted, that atoms and molecules were undeniably real, their invisible impacts causing the visible jittering under microscopes. A pair of swans gliding by on the river. By midsummer, something peculiar began happening in the Einstein household. The postman, who normally brought nothing but bills and the occasional letter from Albert's sister Maya, started appearing with thick envelopes bearing the seals of European universities. From perplexed physicists who had read his papers in Annalen der Physik. Then came the letters of admiration, then the invitations to lecture. One particularly memorable afternoon, a red-faced Professor Kleiner from the University of Zurich arrived at their door unannounced, his carriage splattered with mud from the hurried journey. "Herr Einstein," he gasped, mopping his brow with a large handkerchief, "you've turned our understanding of the universe on its head." As autumn painted the Bernese oaks in fiery hues, Albert found himself standing before a chalkboard at the University of Bern, explaining his radical new concepts to a room full of skeptical academics. His hands, usually so awkward in social situations, moved with graceful certainty as he sketched the warping of space-time. The equations flowed from him like music, each symbol a note in a symphony of revelation. Some professors shook their heads in disbelief, others whispered excitedly among themselves, but all recognized they were witnessing something extraordinary, the birth of a new physics. Yet, amid this growing acclaim, the way Mileva would sometimes stare out the window for long periods, her fingers absently tracing the edge of a framed photograph from their student days in Zurich. The increasing frequency with which she took Hans Albert to visit her parents in Novi Sad, leaving Albert alone with his equations and the quiet emptiness of their apartment. One chilly December evening, returning from yet another lecture to find yet another cold supper waiting, Albert paused in the doorway watching Mileva mend one of the boys' shirts by lamplight. In that moment, he understood with painful clarity that while he had been charting the curvature of the universe, something fundamental in their marriage had bent and fractured beyond repair. The year 1905, which physicists would later call Albert's Annus Mirabilis, or miracle year, closed as it had begun, with snow falling softly on the rooftops of Bern. But nothing was the same. The obscure patent clerk had become the author of 4 revolutionary papers that redefined our understanding of light, matter, space, and time. The equation E equals mc, scribbled almost as an afterthought in one paper, hinted at energies beyond human comprehension. As church bells rang in the new year, Albert stood at his window watching fireworks explode over the medieval city, their colored lights reflecting in his tired eyes. Somewhere out there, he knew, the universe was stranger and more wonderful than anyone had imagined, and his journey to understand it had only just begun. The winter of 1906 settled over Bern like a leaden blanket, the frost painting intricate patterns on the windows of the patent office where Albert Einstein still reported dutifully each morning, though the academic world was beginning to buzz about his revolutionary papers. Here at the Swiss Federal Institute of Intellectual Property, little had changed. He still shared his small workspace with a perpetually ink-stained clerk named Besso, who often returned from lunch smelling of bratwurst and cheap wine. The two would pass their afternoons in quiet camaraderie, Albert absently correcting patent applications, while his mind wandered through thought experiments about the nature of inertia. One particularly bleak January morning, as snow piled up against the building's sandstone walls, a letter arrived that would alter the course of Albert's life. The envelope bore the crest of the University of Bern. His hands trembled slightly as he broke the seal knot from cold, but from the realization that this modest offer of a privatdozent position, an unpaid lectureship, represented his first tentative step into academia. That evening, he rushed home through the snow-laden streets, the letter clutched in his pocket like a talisman, only to find Mileva in the midst of one of her increasingly frequent migraines, the curtains drawn tight against the winter light. On his first day as a university instructor, only 3 students appeared in the cavernous classroom to engineering undergraduates who clearly regretted their choice, and an elderly auditor who promptly fell asleep. Albert's voice, never particularly strong, faltered as he attempted to explain his radical views on thermodynamics to the near-empty room. But by the 4th week, whispers about the patent clerk who solved the universe's mysteries had spread through the university, and his audience grew to include not just students, but curious professors from other departments. They came initially as skeptics, arms crossed over their chests, only to leave with brows furrowed in thought, muttering about this relativity business. As spring thawed the Ari River, Albert's dual life intensified. Mornings were spent at the patent office reviewing electromechanical devices, afternoons lecturing on theoretical physics, and evenings locked in feverish correspondence with Max Planck and other luminaries who now sought his opinions. The strain began to show in the deepening lines around his eyes, in the way his shirts hung slightly looser on his frame. Mileva watched this transformation with quiet despair, her own academic ambitions long since sacrificed to motherhood and marriage. One May evening, as she helped their now 4-year-old son Hans Albert with his letters, she overheard Albert explaining time dilation to a visiting physicist using their good silverware as props. The sight of their wedding cutlery arranged to demonstrate space-time curvature proved too much. She quietly took the boy to his room and closed the door with uncharacteristic force. The summer of 1907 brought both triumph and sorrow. The University of Zurich offered Albert a coveted associate professorship, complete with actual salary. But the same week this news arrived. Little Lacertha daughter, Albert and Mileva, had left with her family in Serbia years earlier, succumbed to scarlet fever. The loss went unspoken between them, a raw wound beneath the surface of their increasingly strained interactions. When they moved to Zurich that autumn, the boxes of baby clothes Mileva quietly stored in their new attic spoke volumes. Zurich should have been a fresh start. The university welcomed Albert as a rising star, his lectures now packed to standing room only. Students whispered about Professor Einstein's unconventional teaching methods, how he might suddenly interrupt a dry explanation of electromagnetism to burst into laughter at some private insight, or how he often forgot to wear socks. But at home, the distance between Albert and Mileva yawned wider. She, who had once been his intellectual equal, now found herself relegated to the role of housewife, her sharp mind dulled by the drudgery of maintaining their household on an academic salary. The winter of 1909 marked their final unraveling. Returning early from a lecture one December evening, Albert found the apartment dark, save for a single lamp where Mileva sat writing a letter to her family. In the golden pool of light, he saw with sudden clarity how the years had hardened her once youthful features, how her fingers, which had once danced across mathematical proofs with grace, now moved stiffly, the knuckles swollen from scrubbing laundry. She looked up, and in that unguarded moment, before she composed her face, Albert saw the truth. His pursuit of cosmic mysteries had cost them both more than he'd realized. When the invitation came from the German university in Prague, the following springer, full professorship with a substantial salary, Albert accepted with mixed feelings. The ancient city's spires and cobblestone streets might have charmed him under different circumstances, but arriving alone from Mileva had taken Hans Albert to visit her parents in Serbia. The grandeur of his new position rang hollow. His spacious office in the Carolinum's Physics Institute overlooked a courtyard where Franciscan monks tended rose bushes, their quiet devotion a stark contrast to the storm raging in his personal life. Letters from Mileva grew increasingly infrequent. When they did arrive, they spoke of practical matters, child support, the disposition of their Zurich furniture, with only occasional flashes of the woman who had once debated physics with him late into the night. One such letter, dated June 1911, contained a single heartbreaking postscript. Hans Albert asked today when Papa is coming home. I didn't know what to tell him. Albert threw himself into his work with renewed intensity. It was in Prague, walking alone through the Jewish quarters, twisting alleys, that the first inklings of his general theory of relativity came to him. The insight struck with physical force as he crossed the Charles Bridge one foggy morning. Realization that gravity wasn't a force at all, but the curvature of space-time itself. He barely made it to his office before the equations came pouring out, transforming his blackboard into a spiderweb of tensor calculus that would leave his assistants baffled for days. But even as his professional star rose with invitations, now coming from Leiden, Berlin, and even America, Albert found the nights increasingly unbearable. The grand apartment the university provided echoed with absence. Sometimes, unable to sleep, he would take his violin to the institute's rooftop and play Bach's partitas as dawn painted Prague's 100 spires gold, the notes scattering across the Vltava River like so many unanswered questions. By 1912, the marriage was beyond repair. When Malava finally returned to Zurich with Hans Albert that summer, the divorce papers followed shortly after. Signing them in his Prague office, Albert noticed his hand was steady. No tremor of hesitation, just the smooth motion of a pen ending one chapter so another might begin. Outside his window, the monks tended their roses with the same quiet care. As always, their world undisturbed by the collapse of his that autumn. As Europe stood unknowingly on the brink of war, Albert received 2 letters on the same day. One, from Max Planck, invited him to join the prestigious Prussian Academy of Sciences in Berlin. The other, from Malava, contained a drawing by Hans Albert, a childish rendering of a man with wild hair standing beside a rocket ship. On the back, in careful script, Papa's light beam ride. Albert framed the picture and placed it on his desk, where it would remain for the rest of his life, a bittersweet reminder of what his pursuit of light had cost, and what it might yet illuminate. The Berlin years unfolded like one of those strange dreams where time moves at different speeds, some moments dragging like molasses, others flashing by in a blink. Albert Einstein, now a full member of the Prussian Academy with his divorce papers, barely 6 months old, found himself standing at the threshold of both scientific immortality and personal reckoning. The city in 1914 was a study in contrasts. Electric streetcars humming past horse-drawn milk wagons, the scent of coal smoke mixing with the lime trees, spring blossoms along Unter den Linden. His new apartment on Wittelsbacher Strasse echoed with absence, no childish laughter, no wife's quiet footfalls, just the hollow sound of his own steps crossing polished hardwood floors. Mornings began with the same ritual. Awakening before dawn, he'd never shaken his patent office hours. Albert would brew weak wartime coffee substitute and spread his papers across the kitchen table. The calculations for his general theory of relativity demanded total concentration. Calculus that made his head throb, equations that sprawled across dozens of pages. Sometimes he'd work straight through until evening, only realizing he'd forgotten to eat when Elsa arrived with a pot of stew or a loaf of black bread, scolding him gently like a mother would a careless child. Your brain may run on equations, she'd say, setting the food before him with deliberate clatter, but the rest of you still needs potatoes. The war changed everything and nothing. Outside his window, Berlin transformed young men disappeared into uniforms. Zeppelins blotted out stars during blackouts. Newspapers screamed of victories that tasted increasingly like defeat. But inside Albert's study, time moved differently. While Europe tore itself apart, he pursued the most beautiful idea of his life, that gravity wasn't a force at all, but the curvature of space-time itself. The revelation had come to him years earlier. In that happiest thought, a man falling from a roof wouldn't feel his own weight. Now, as artillery shook the ground along the Western Front, he wrestled with the mathematics to prove it. November 1915 became the month that split physics in two. With Berlin's first snow dusting the streets outside, Albert worked in a feverish trance. Days blurred together as he corrected errors, refined equations, chased the perfect formulation. On the 4th, he presented his field equations to the Academy only to discover a fatal flaw weeks later. For 3 sleepless nights he labored. The gas lamps turned low due to wartime rationing, his shadow looming large on the study walls as he paced between desk and blackboard. Then, on the 25th, it came together with crystalline clarity. R1/2 Rg mu nu equals 8g CTAGTEN, symbols that described how matter told space how to curve, and space told matter how to move. When he finally stepped back from the blackboard, chalk dust coating his sweater like first snow, his hands trembled not from exhaustion but awe. He'd glimpsed the universe's hidden blueprint, planets orbiting not because they were pulled, but because they rolled along invisible curves in the cosmic fabric. News traveled slowly through war-torn Europe. The British naval blockade kept scientific journals from crossing the Channel. But somehow word reached Cambridge, where a young astronomer named Arthur Eddington read Einstein's papers with growing excitement. Here was a testable prediction. Starlight grazing the sun should bend by precisely 1.75 arcseconds. The 1919 solar eclipse would tell the tale. Peace brought chaos to Berlin. Revolutionaries clashed with Freikorps in the streets. Bread lines stretched around blocks. Yet, through it all, Albert waited for confirmation. When it finally came, a telegram from Eddington. On September 22, 1919, the world suddenly took notice. Overnight, the rumpled professor became international celebrity. Reporters camped outside his apartment. Cartoonists exaggerated his wild hair. Women sent perfumed letters. Now I understand why the ancients feared eclipses, he joked to Elsa. After one particularly intrusive interview, they turn men into gods. But fame had its shadows. The more the world celebrated him, the further he drifted from the people who'd mattered most. Letters from Hans Albert arrived less frequently. The boy's careful script, now tinged with adolescent resentment. Younger son Edward's mental health deteriorated alarmingly. The first whispers of schizophrenia that would eventually claim him, and Mileva remained a ghost in every room, her absence more palpable than any presence. Sometimes, when the accolades grew suffocating, Albert would take his violin to the lakeside cabin near Potsdam and play until his fingers bled. The music carrying across water that mirrored the sky, 2 vast, interconnected curves bending toward some distant, unknowable horizon. by 1921. When he sailed to America for the first time, the pattern was set. Publicly, he was Einstein the genius, giving lectures to packed halls, joking with reporters, posing with Charlie Chaplin at a Hollywood premiere. Privately, he was a man increasingly isolated by his own intellect, chasing the elusive unified field theory that would reconcile gravity with electromagnetism. The equations refused to cooperate, but he persisted, not out of ambition now, but because the work was all he had left. Nights were the hardest. Lying awake in strange hotel rooms from Tokyo to Princeton, he'd sometimes take out a worn photograph from 1905, a young patent clerk with a baby on his knee and a dark-haired woman smiling beside him, and wonder about parallel universes. If time was relative, as he'd proven, could there be some other version of events where he'd made different choices, where he'd been content with the ordinary happiness of an ordinary life? The thought always passed. Dawn would break, another day would begin, and the equations would still be waiting. The universe, he now knew, was written in a language of curved space-time and relative motion. But human hearts followed no such elegant rules. They simply ached, linear and absolute, marching stubbornly forward through time's unyielding flow. The 1920s unfolded like a curious paradox, years that saw Albert Einstein ascend to global fame while simultaneously retreating into deeper intellectual isolation. Berlin's cafes still buzzed with his name, newspapers still printed his every quip, yet the man himself grew increasingly untethered from the world that celebrated him. His study at Haberlandstrasse 5 became a sanctuary of scattered papers and pipe smoke, where the faint scent of Elsa's rosewater perfume lingered in the curtains, a delicate counterpoint to the sharp tang of chalk, dust, and tobacco. The quantum dilemma consumed him. His own 1905 work on photons had helped birth this strange new physics. But now the younger generation, Bohr, Heisenberg, Schrödinger, were taking it places that unsettled him. God does not play dice with the universe, he'd growl during the now legendary Solvay conference debates, fingers twisting his trademark silver pipe as Pauli and Born exchanged knowing glances. Yet, for all his protests, the evidence mounted. The subatomic world really did behave probabilistically, a realization that struck him with the force of personal betrayal. Night after night, he'd pace the study, wrestling with thought experiments to prove the quantum theorists wrong. The famous EPR paradox paper would emerge from these fevered sessions, a last brilliant attempt to preserve determinism in an increasingly uncertain cosmos. Meanwhile, Germany unraveled. The inflationary crisis turned university salaries to worthless paper. Sa once bought theater tickets with a stack of bills thinner than the play's program. Brown shirts began appearing at his lectures, their jackboots scraping ominously against lecture hall floors. The change came gradually, then all at once. First, his books were removed from libraries. Then his colleagues stopped meeting his eyes in the academy corridors. Finally, the newspapers began printing cartoons of Jewish physics, with his wild hair caricatured into horns. The breaking point came on a crystalline winter morning in 1932. When returning from his California lecture tour, he found his country house near Kaputh vandalized not by random hooligans, but with precise, methodical defacement. Equations scratched out, violin strings severed, a single word painted across his blackboard, Jude. That night, as Elsa packed their valuables with trembling hands, Albert stood at the window, watching Snowblanket, the Brandenburg countryside, one last time. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who'd redefined space and time now found himself trapped by both. Forced to abandon the homeland that had once embraced his genius but now rejected his blood, Princeton welcomed him with quiet dignity. The white clapboard house at 112 Mercer Street reminded him oddly of childhood UMO, with its gabled roof and creaking wooden floors. Institute for Advanced Study colleagues treated him with respectful distance. The legendary Professor Einstein, who occasionally wandered into seminars wearing no socks, muttering in German-accented English about spooky action at a distance. Students would whisper stories of finding him lost in thought on some park bench, a Hoffaten apple forgotten in one hand, a notebook filled with equations in the other. America both embraced and mystified him. The jazz drifting from radios reminded him of Batch's improvisations, yet the relentless optimism felt alien after European cynicism. He took to sailing on Carnegie Lake, the small wooden boat becoming his floating study, where relativity notebooks lay safely wrapped in oilskin beside sandwiches Elsa had prepared. These were his happiest hours, just the lap of water against Hull, the cry of herons, and the endless puzzle of unified field theory stretching before him like the Raritan River at dusk. Then the letters began arriving from Europe, first from Planck, then Sommerfeld, then Lisa Meitner, describing the systematic dismantling of German physics. Colleagues dismissed, laboratories purged, entire research lines abandoned as degenerate. Each envelope contained some new horror, until the day in 1939 when Leo Szilard appeared at his doorstep with news of nuclear fission and the very real possibility of a German atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project invitation arrived on embossed stationery, but Albert declined with polite firmness. His equation, E equals mc, may have made the bomb possible, but his conscience wouldn't permit him to help build it. Instead, he spent the war years working on naval explosives systems, a compromise that left him washing his hands with peculiar vigor each evening, as if scrubbing away moral stains. When Hiroshima's flash illuminated the New Mexico desert, he was in his Princeton kitchen, hearing the news on the radio while stirring ersatz coffee. The spoon clattered from his fingers. "Oh well," he whispered, not in German, not in English, but in the universal language of grief. Post-war fame took on a hollow quality. Magazine covers proclaimed him man of the century, while pacifist rallies decried him as father of the bomb. Through it all, he maintained a quiet routine: morning walks down Mercer Street, afternoons at the Institute, evenings playing Mozart with whoever could tolerate his enthusiastic, if not particularly skilled, violin playing. The unified field theory remained stubbornly out of reach, its equations dissolving into nonsense whenever he peered too closely. Final years brought both honors and losses. Elsa's death in 1936 had left him untethered, though he'd never admit it. Now Margot and Helen Dukas became his surrogate family, managing his correspondence and gently steering him toward meals when he forgot to eat. The world continued seeking his wisdom on everything from civil rights to nuclear disarmament, though increasingly his answers came wrapped in weary paradoxes. "I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought," he told one interviewer, "but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones." April 1955 arrived with unseasonable warmth. Working on what would be his final equations, Albert suddenly clutched his chest, the pain sharp as a mathematical insight. Rushed to Princeton Hospital, he refused surgery with characteristic stubbornness. "I have done my share. It is time to go." As dawn broke on the 18th, his breathing slowed to irregular intervals, time itself growing relative in that sterile room. When the end came, his last words were in a language only the nurse understood, not German or English, but numbers, whispered like a lullaby to the universe he'd spent a lifetime trying to understand. On his desk back at Mercer Street, amid the unfinished calculations and unanswered mail, lay a framed photograph from 1905, a young patent clerk with a baby on his knee and a dark-haired woman smiling beside him. The glass reflected the morning sun as it climbed over Princeton, casting prismatic light across equations that would outlive their creator, continuing their silent dialogue with eternity. The world kept turning in the strange, hollow days after Albert's passing, as if the laws of physics themselves were reluctant to acknowledge his absence. Princeton, in springtime, carried on with its quiet rhythms, dogwoods blooming along Mercer Street, students bicycling to lectures, the occasional delivery truck rumbling past 112 Mercer, where the curtains now remained drawn. Inside, the house preserved him in amber, pipes resting in their holders, a half-finished bowl of soup still on the kitchen table, blackboards covered in equations that no one would dare erase. Margot and Helen moved through rooms like ghosts, answering the endless stream of condolence telegrams while fielding calls from presidents and physicists alike. The mail piled up in teetering stacks, school children requesting autographs, unaware the hand they sought would never write again. Fellow refugees pleading for assistance. Crackpots claiming to have solved unified field theory in ways the great man supposedly couldn't conceive. At the Institute for Advanced Study, Oppenheimer organized an impromptu memorial beneath the oak trees where Albert often walked. The gathering attracted faces from every chapter of that improbable life. Bohr arrived looking 20 years older than when they'd last debated quantum theory. Szilard stood apart with haunted eyes. G. Goodell muttered about temporal paradoxes too. Anyone who would listen. They spoke in hushed tones of the man rather than the myth. How he'd hated socks but loved sailing. How his laughter could shake a room when a joke struck him just right. How he'd scribble equations on napkins during faculty dinners, much to the hostess' dismay. When the Princeton String Quartet played Mozart's Einklang, notched Musica's favorite Ita single violins, a string snapped with a sound like a tiny universe collapsing across the Atlantic. Reactions split along fault lines of history. In Jerusalem, the Hebrew University displayed his original relativity manuscript under glass, the cramped handwriting still bearing coffee stains from burned days. Berlin's Academy of Sciences debated whether to remove his portrait from their gallery before the party made the decision for them. In ULM, the house where he was born became an impromptu shrine. Locals leaving flowers and candles despite not having claimed him when he lived. Switzerland maintained a dignified silence. The neutral country that had twice given him refuge, now quietly processing his last effects from the patent office where it all began, back in Princeton. The autopsy revealed what Albert had suspected, but never confirmed: an abdominal aortic aneurysm grown to grotesque proportions, its swollen walls pressing against his organs for who knew how long. The pathologist marveled at how the man had functioned through such pain, until remembering this was the same person who'd reimagined the cosmos while reviewing patents for electromagnetic coils. They removed the brain without permission. Harvey, the pathologist, justifying the theft as scientific necessities, slicing it into 240 cubes that would spend decades being shuttled between labs and safety deposit boxes before anyone noticed. Its most remarkable feature wasn't anatomical, but metaphorical. Here was an ordinary 3-pound organ that had conceived fourth-dimensional physics. The funeral was small, private, exactly as he'd wanted. No state ceremony, no military honors. 12 people gathered at Trenton's Ewing Cemetery on a drizzly April afternoon. The rabbi read Kadesh in Hebrew while rain streaked the simple pine casket. Helen placed his well-worn violin inside at the last moment, whispering, "You'll want this," before the lid closed forever. There was no headstone initially, just a numbered plot. Fear of vandalism, keeping the location secret until the world calmed down. When they returned to Mercer Street, they found a lone reporter camped on the porch, notebook ready. Margot gave him Albert's last unfinished statement on nuclear disarmament and sent him away weeping. Months passed, seasons changed. The FBI finally closed its 1,427-page dossier on Albert Einstein, subversive. His pipe collection was donated to the Smithsonian, where curators debated whether to preserve the tobacco smell embedded in the briar. The house became a museum faster than anyone expected. Tourists peering through windows at the study, where space-time had been rewritten, as if expecting to see equations still glowing in the air. And then there were the letters. Dozens arrived, weekly, addressed simply to Professor Einstein, Princeton. Some contained solutions to unified field theory, written in crayon by children. Others held desperate notes from European refugees he'd once helped, unaware their savior was gone. The postmaster, unsure what to do, began storing them in a special cabinet marked Letters to Heaven. On what would have been his 76th birthday, Helen took a walk to the Institute. The oak trees were turning gold, their leaves whispering secrets to the ground. She passed a young couple arguing near Einstein's favorite bench, the woman insisting light couldn't possibly be both particle and wave, the man countering that the old professor had proved it long ago. Helen smiled and kept walking. Some equations never stopped solving themselves at dusk. She returned to 112 Mercer and did something she'd never dared while he lived. Opened the bottom desk drawer. Inside lay hundreds of unsent letters to Hans, Albert, and Edward, each one a masterpiece of paternal love and regret. Setting them aside, she found what she'd suspected might be their single sheet dated March 1955, containing just 3 lines of writing. "I see now that time is the only true dimension. All else space, matter, even lighter, merely shadows it casts as it passes." Helen carefully returned the paper to its resting place. Outside, Princeton's streetlights flickered on, one by one, their glow bending ever so slightly in the evening mist, just as starlight had bent around the sun, proving him right all those years ago. Somewhere beyond the atmosphere, perhaps his light still traveled, forever chasing that beam he'd imagined riding as a young man in Bern. The universe, it seemed, was still keeping his secrets. The years folded over themselves like pages in a well-worn notebook after Albert's passing. each one smoothing the sharp edges of grief while leaving the indelible ink of his legacy untouched. Princeton settled into its new identity as the keeper of the Einstein Mytha ivy-covered buildings of the Institute for Advanced Study, now hosting pilgrims ranging from Nobel laureates to wide-eyed schoolchildren clutching their relativity primers. At 112 Mercer Street, Helen Dukas maintained her quiet vigil, sorting through mountains of correspondence with the same meticulous care she'd shown when the professor was alive. The house itself seemed reluctant to move on. His study remained frozen in time, a thin layer of chalk dust still coating the blackboard where his last equations stood like unfinished symphonies. Summer brought the first wave of curious visitors. A Japanese physicist arrived unannounced one humid July morning, bearing a carefully wrapped gift, a delicate origami crane folded from the pages of Einstein's 1905 paper on light quanta. Helen placed it on the mantel beside the framed photograph of young Albert with Mileva and Hans Albert, the two artifacts forming silent bookends to an extraordinary life. The physicist bowed deeply before leaving, his eyes lingering on the empty armchair where the world's most famous thinker had once wrestled with the universe's secrets. As autumn painted the maples along Mercer Street in fiery hues, the first serious biographers came knocking. They arrived with tape recorders and hungry eyes, hoping to extract some previously untold anecdote that might explain genius. Helen dutifully served them tea, while revealing little she knew how Albert had despised the cult of personality growing around him. He was just a man who asked good questions, she'd say, watching their faces fall at the banality of the truth. Only to a select few did she confide the smaller, more human details. How he'd hummed Brahms while shaving, how his eyes would light up at the smell of Elsa's mushroom soup, how he'd kept every letter from his sons in a locked drawer, even the angry ones from Edward's darkest days in the Swiss asylum. Winter unveiled a different kind of pilgrim. On the coldest night of 1956, Helen awoke to find an elderly woman standing in the backyard, her gloved hands pressed against the study window. By the time Helen reached her, the intruder had vanished into the snow, leaving only footprints and a single white rose on the windowsill. The incident repeated itself every January thereafter, always during the first snowfall, always leaving a fresh rose. Helen eventually stopped calling the police, recognizing the ritual for what it was: someone's private communion with the ghost of better days. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the world Albert had left behind continued wrestling with his legacy. In Berlin, workers quietly removed the plaque commemorating his apartment at Haberlandstrasse 5, while in Jerusalem, construction began on the Einstein Institute of Mathematics. The Swiss Patent Office in Bern became an unlikely tourist destination. Guides pointing to the third-floor window where a board clerk had revolutionized physics. Even Kaputh, the lakeside cottage the Nazis had confiscated, saw visitors rowing out to peer at its boarded-up windows, as if expecting to see the ghost of a sailboat drifting across the water. The scientific community faced its own reckoning. Younger physicists, raised on relativity and quantum theory, began pushing beyond Einstein's work. At a contentious 1957 conference, Feynman famously quipped, "We're all standing on Einstein's shoulders, but the view's getting crowded." Yet in quiet moments, even the most brash researchers would admit their equations still spoke his language. tensor calculus of general relativity remaining the gold standard for understanding gravity. While his old debates with Bohr about quantum mechanics took on new urgency in the dawning age of particle accelerators, back in Princeton, Helen noticed something peculiar happening with the mail. Letters addressed to Einstein kept arriving, not just from admirers, but from institutions he'd corresponded with for decades. The Royal Society still invited him to events. Scientific journals sent proofs for review. Even the White House forwarded policy briefings. At first, she marked them return to sender. But as the years passed, she began filing them in boxes labeled for the archives, recognizing that in some bureaucratic sense, Albert Einstein would never truly be dead. The most unexpected correspondence came in 1965, when a package arrived from the Soviet Union containing a leather-bound notebook. Inside were meticulous Russian-language notes from a Gulag prisoner who had independently derived E equals mc in 1938, unaware the equation already existed. A covering letter from the now rehabilitated physicist explained he'd survived the labor camps by doing relativity calculations on stolen scraps of paper. "Your husband's mind was my companion in darkness," he wrote to Helen. She placed the notebook in the study, where afternoon sunlight fell across its pages, just as it had once illuminated Albert's own work. As the decade turned, Mercer Street became a time capsule of the 1950s. Helen resisted updating appliances or redecorating, preserving the house exactly as Albert had left it. The black-and-white television still received only 3 channels. The icebox still required actual ice, and the rotary phone's cord remained stretched from years of pacing during conversations. Visitors remarked on the peculiar sensation of stepping into the past until the moment they noticed the stack of current scientific journals on the coffee table, their pages dog-eared in characteristic fashion. Helen might preserve history, but she remained determined to keep up with its unfolding. The roses kept coming each winter until 1980, when Helen found not 1 but 2 on the windowsill, the second, slightly smaller, as if left by a different hand. That same week, a young physicist from Caltech arrived with astonishing news. Astronomers had detected gravitational waves, the last unconfirmed prediction of general relativity, as the researcher excitedly explained how collapsing neutron stars had sent ripples through space-time itself. Helen quietly opened Albert's desk drawer and placed a fresh sheet of paper atop his unfinished work. Somewhere, she imagined him smiling, that familiar, lopsided smile, both pleased and mildly annoyed that the universe was still proving him right. On the centennial of his birth in 1979, the world erupted in celebration. Lectures, exhibitions, and television specials proliferated Einstein's wild-haired visage, becoming as recognizable as the Mona Lisa. Princeton hosted a star-studded symposium where Hawking, Sagan, and Yang debated his legacy. Yet the most poignant tribute occurred spontaneously that night, when thousands gathered on the Institute's lawn with flashlights, holding them aloft to form a shimmering, human-made constellation, each tiny beam following the curved paths his equations had predicted decades earlier. Helen lived long enough to see the first personal computers, smiling when she learned physicists were using them to simulate Einstein's spooky action at a distance. She passed away in 1982, leaving strict instructions for the house's preservation. The last entry in her diary read, "Today I packed another box of letters addressed to A.E. The postman asked. I said, no, the world still needs someone to listen." And so the letters kept coming. Decades after both their deaths, people still wrote to Albert Einstein children seeking advice about science fair projects, philosophers pondering the nature of time, even lonely hearts sharing secrets they couldn't tell anyone living. The current caretakers, a rotation of institute graduate students, continue the tradition Helen began, responding to each one with photocopied excerpts from his writings. The most common reply, sent to thousands across 7 continents, contains his most enduring wisdom. The important thing is never to stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existing. Somewhere between the atoms and the stars, in the warped space-time he first mapped, one imagines Albert would be pleased to know his conversation with the universe continues, not through grandiose monuments, but in the simple, endless human act of wondering why. Time, that mysterious river Albert had spent a lifetime mapping, continued its inexorable flow long after the world had said its goodbyes. The 21st century dawned with his face becoming one of the most recognized in human history, an icon of genius, reproduced on everything from college dorm posters to quantum computing research grants. Yet, in the quiet corners where true legacy resides, more remarkable things were unfolding. At Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study, where the oak trees Albert once walked under now stretched gnarled branches over new generations of thinkers. A curious phenomenon occurred each April. On the anniversary of his passing, physicists from around the world would gather spontaneously in the small cafeteria. No organized memorial, just an unspoken understanding. They came with notebooks and coffee, arguing passionately about holographic universes and dark energy, precisely the kind of lively debate he'd loved. The caretakers had long since stopped trying to reserve tables. They simply set out extra chairs and, in a nod to tradition, a plate of the oatmeal raisin cookies Albert had been fond of. The house on Mercer Street became a museum, frozen in poetic contradiction, both perfectly preserved and constantly evolving. Visitors could still see the pipe burns on the desk, the chalk-smudged sweaters in the closet, the well-worn violin in its case. But now interactive displays allowed children to simulate riding a light beam, while holographic projectors recreated his famous thought experiments in mid-air. The most poignant exhibit remained untouched, the small bedroom where Helen Dukas had continued living until her death, its walls lined with filing cabinets containing over 30,000 letters Albert had received during his lifetime. Archivists were still cataloging them a century later, discovering forgotten correspondences with everyone from Indian mystics to Mississippi sharecroppers. Science marched forward, bearing his indelible stamp. The 2016 detection of gravitational waves sent ripples through the physics community, not just for proving his century-old prediction, but for the haunting beauty of the Signula cosmic chirp, lasting less than a second, echoing the collision of 2 black holes over 1 billion years ago. When researchers converted the space-time ripples into sound waves, the resulting tone resonated at middle C, the same note Albert had often tuned his violin to. Journalists called it a coincidence. The physicists who wept upon hearing it knew better. His brain, that most famous of organs, completed its own improbable journey. After decades adrift in pathology labs and safety deposit boxes, the preserved sections were finally returned to Princeton Medical Center in 2021. There, advanced neuroimaging revealed what simple dissection never could: extraordinary connectivity between hemispheres, a physical manifestation of the man who saw mathematics in music and physics in sailing. The head researcher, herself a refugee's granddaughter, insisted on one condition: the slides would never become macabre exhibits, but remain available only for legitimate scientific study. He gave enough to the world while living, she told. The press. Children continued writing letters, though now they arrived as emails and holograms. A particularly moving collection came from a global Letters to Einstein project, where young students shared their visions for the future of science. One stood out: a blind girl from Nairobi who'd built a tactile model of curved spacetime using beads and fishing line. "Dear Professor," she wrote, "I can't see the stars, but I can feel how they pull." Her model now sat in the Mercer Street study, right beside his pipe. The roses never stopped coming. Each January, as snow blanketed Princeton, fresh blooms appeared on the study windowsill. Security cameras installed in the 1990s captured only blurred figures, always at night, always. During the year's first snowfall, the tradition passed through generations until, in 2035, a young physics student from Berlin was gently apprehended, leaving not just roses, but a sealed envelope. Inside were wartime letters between Albert and a Jewish chemist he'd helped escape. Germany correspondence, long thought lost. The student explained they'd been found hidden in her grandmother's attic, wrapped in the same blue paper, now lining the envelope. On the 150th anniversary of his birth, scientists made an extraordinary announcement: the first successful quantum teleportation of information. As reporters clamored for explanations, the lead researcher simply projected Einstein's 1935 EPR paper on the screen. "He told us the universe was spooky," she said. "We're just finally learning how to listen to its whispers." That night, observatories worldwide trained their telescopes on a single point: the Einstein cross, a gravitational lensing phenomenon where a distant quasar appears as four images around a foreground galaxy. It made for a perfect cosmic memorial, light bending as he'd predicted, forming a cross that had nothing to do with religion and everything to do with geometry. The most profound tribute emerged from an unexpected quarter. In 2042, archaeologists, excavating the ruins of Hitler's Reich Chancellery, uncovered a hidden safe containing Nazi plans to discredit Jewish physics. Among the documents was a memo dated April 18, 1955, the day Albert died, ordering immediate confiscation of all his remaining German publications. History's irony was not lost on scholars. As one light went out in Princeton, the darkness had made its final futile grab. The papers were donated to the Albert Einstein archives, where they sat in silent testimony to truth's ultimate victory centuries from now. When Princeton is dust and human civilization has spread to the stars, some version of this story will likely persist, perhaps engraved on a plaque aboard a generation ship traveling at near light speed, where passengers experience time dilation exactly as predicted, or encoded in quantum fluctuations surrounding a black hole's event horizon, bending space-time into a perfect Einstein ring. However it survives, the essence will remain not just the equations that reshaped our understanding of reality, but the humanity behind them, the refugee who hated nationalism, the pacifist whose work enabled nuclear physics, the lonely dreamer who never stopped wondering about the universe's deepest mysteries back on Earth. In a quiet corner of the Princeton archives, a yellowed piece of notebook paper rests in a climate-controlled case, dated just weeks before his death. It contains 3 lines in shaky handwriting. The universe is not stranger than we imagine. It is stranger than we can imagine, and that is enough. Night falls over Mercer Street. Somewhere, a student opens a relativity textbook for the first time. Somewhere, a violin plays middle C. Somewhere, starlight bends around a distant galaxy. The conversation continues.